The twin bond does exist. Identical twins start out as a whole. And then they split and become two people. When this happened to her, it's like I lost my other half. The other half's gone.
It's a terrible experience to feel like you don't have nobody there for you. Nobody wants to take you in. For me, the perfect home environment would have been someone to be there to love me, take care for me, and just having a sense of family. Okay. My name is Anthony Standifer. I've been incarcerated since 2010 for second-degree murder and first-degree robbery. My childhood was, I wouldn't say the typical childhood. My mother was addicted to drugs for as long as I can remember. My father, even though I knew who he was, he never chose to claim me as his son. So I would see him from time to time, but you know, he would just treat me like a nobody. Even though my mother was on drugs, she was very loving. Yeah, some of the best experience I've had was with her. You know, she took me to different states, traveling with her, being out on the lake, fishing. So I would say I've had good memories with her, you know. But she was in and out. I would see her, you know, for a day or two, then I wouldn't see her for a couple of weeks. You know, I ended up going into foster care because of, I was living with my auntie and she felt like she couldn't deal with me. So she just threw all my stuff in a trash bag and took me down to Division of Family Services and gave me over to the state. For a kid to be, you know, just thrown away like that from his family and felt like no one loves him. Yeah, that's definitely one of the worst times of my life. At the time, she had sobered up and got off drugs. She had remarried, and I thought that it would be a good opportunity for us to be together, for us to finally have a chance to be a family. But once I moved back to Kansas City, that is definitely when all the trouble started. Her husband at the time had a son. He was 16, and he had been involved with gangs. Also, I had a brother, my half brother, through my mother. He had been involved in gangs. They were definitely role models to me. I didn't really have any role models at that time, and I definitely looked up to a lot of the things that they did. If they were selling drugs, I wanted to sell drugs. If they was robbing, then that's what I wanted to do. I was at a place called McCune School for Boys, something like a juvenile penitentiary. And I got called in to the office. And so she hands the phone over to me, and it's my mother. And she tells me that my brother had been murdered that night. Yeah. When I left juvenile, now with my brother gone, I wasn't the same person. I adopted an attitude that I didn't care about anything or anybody. And once I adopted that attitude and that mindset, it allowed me to do whatever I want without having no regard to the consequences. I just didn't care anymore. I wasn't working, she wasn't working, so we was in desperate need of money. I was out one night and I got a call from a guy that I had previously been involved in robberies together. His name is Jay Nix. And he calls me and says, hey, do you want to rob this drug dealer? I said, well, how much is involved? He says about 80 grand, and the guys that have like 50 or so pounds of marijuana. I said, yeah. So I get off the phone with him, make another call to a guy that I know, a DJ. Me and DJ, we get in the car, we head over to meet Jay Nix. Jay Nix, he hands me a piece of paper. He says there's 3 addresses on it. He says the house should look like this, and the guy's driving an orange Dodge Magnum on some 24-inch rims. He says you can't miss it. I said, all right. He gives me the gun. So we're driving around the neighborhood. We can't find the addresses. We can't find this orange Dodge Magnum. So I get out and I start scouring the neighborhood on foot. I end up finding the house. I call Jay Nix. I say, hey, I found the house, but there's no Dodge Magnum out front. I said, what other kind of car do they have? And he names the car that's identical to the one that's in the driveway. So me and DJ, we go to the front of the house and we kick the door in. Once we kick the door in, the front room was pitch black. but I could see somebody. DJ grabs the person and slams him down to the ground. Once I reach for the lamp and turn it on, I see a woman. Once I seen that it was an older woman, I immediately knew that this was the wrong house. I take the gun, and while she's on the ground, I stand over her. I tell DJ, well, finish searching the house. Maybe we're mistaken. He comes back, he said, there's nothing back there. So I'm thinking now that I just got off parole, I don't want to go back to prison. She had seen my face. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna kill her. I stand over her and pull the trigger. One time. And I asked myself, why did I do that? And every day, there is no answer that makes sense.
Hi. Good, how are you?
So we make the food.
No, we can use this for the chicken fried steaks.
Here you go.
Okay. Are they still hot?
You guys
Sharon?
want to?
You brought the food. You sit down and relax.
Let's see. That looks good.
We were a very tight-knit family. We did everything together.
I haven't had lunch the last 2 days.
Goodness knows there's a lot
Dude, they're
of
trying to
food.
make me fat at work.
We didn't necessarily have everything, but we had everything we needed. And I couldn't ask for better.
You want some sauce? You need to. You want some?
My name's Dana Crowell. Beverly's my mom. Growing up, my family was mainly me, my brothers, and my sister with my mom. Our parents were divorced, so we didn't see him as often as we probably would have liked to. But mom was our support. She did everything for us. My mom was very nurturing. She was probably the huggiest person I've ever met.
And, you know, she's always
Holding
touching
your
you.
hand.
It's always like if you're sitting there, she just like this, sweetie.
You do the same thing though.
But you do, yeah, you do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Same thing.
She never made us feel like we were bothersome to her.
Yeah.
I think it's important to let your kids know you want them and you want them around you. She joined the police in 1976, and she worked at the Independence Police Department. She was a records clerk. She helped officers write their reports, so she heard everything bad that happened. And we didn't get to do anything because she wasn't going to have her kids out there causing trouble. The day I found out about Mom was March 19th. It was a Friday. I was getting ready for work. It was about 20 after 7. And my phone rang, and it was my brother-in-law, Steve. And he said, "I just talked to Aunt Barbara. She asked me if I could stop by your mom's house. Something doesn't look right over there." And I turned onto her street, and I could see that the screen door was standing open. And I stuck my head in. I didn't even walk into the living room. And I could see her laying there. And I just leaned back out and closed the door. And I had my phone in my hand, and I called 911. And it wasn't 2 minutes later that officers were there. The impact of losing our mom on my family has been immeasurable. It's so big I can't even really explain it. She's like a guiding soul in my life. Every day I drive by the cemetery, I say hi to her. Every morning I tell her good morning. I don't like to use the word monster, but there it is. In my heart, he's a monster. In an ideal world, he will die behind bars and never see the light of day again. I don't know what made him pull the trigger. I wish I did. Maybe I would understand a little better and be able to forgive him if I knew why. It's a mindset I will never understand. That's not the world I grew up in. I think he was raised in a world where that was just sort of the way things are. And part of me feels bad for him living in a world like that, but you don't have to be a product of what brought you up. You can make a different choice. And I don't think he made a different choice. And he had the option to not live the life he lived.
Let's go. Say hi to the guys. I'm Susan Thompson, Anthony Stander's auntie. Come here, Diamond. Come here, girl. Say hi. Anthony grew up midtown, in the middle of the hood. It was a rough area. Anthony's dad was very controlling. He was just very abusive, very putting his mom down, putting him down. You're nothing, your mom's nothing. He just went through a lot of verbal abuse. And I think it affected Anthony in a big way, you know? He had experienced the violence in the home, you know? He had experienced the drugs. Anthony's dad left the house when little Anthony was about 3 or 4. And from that, everything just kind of went downhill. Anthony's mom would allow the drug pushers to take over her house. You know, her house would become the spot. She was in the streets. She was doing drugs. She was here. She was there. She was everywhere. You know, you couldn't put your hand on her. It just wasn't a healthy situation. My mom took little Anthony on. It lasted maybe a month or 2, and my mom was moving out of town, and I was left with little Anthony. I also had 6 children of my own. One of my sons had cerebral palsy. He didn't walk or talk. So I wasn't in a position to devote my attention toward little Anthony for what he needed, because he definitely needed one-on-one. This kid's been exposed to a lot, you know what I'm saying? And I didn't want that shit to rub off on my kids at the house. Oh, this particular day, I was like, oh, hell no, I ain't gonna be to handle him, so I'll go down here to the state building, Juvenile Justice Center. And I tell him, hey, yo, I got this kid. My sister's on drugs. You know, you guys need to get her a court order. This is what I'm thinking. They're going to get a court order, drag her in here and make her get herself cleaned up. And I'm going to help her and I'm going to help her son and we're going to reunite them back together. And that wasn't the case. She never responded to the courts. Little Anthony then went into foster care. And he was molested in foster care. It breaks my heart to know that I even had anything to do with what he was subjected to. Had I never put him in the state's custody, you know, we probably have a whole different young man today, because all that did was made him even more messed up in his head. He started hanging out with like street guys, older guys than him, doing things. It just was like a adrenaline rush for him. He was easily influenced. He was gullible. He wanted to belong. They made him feel loved in a way that we have never have. So I could easily see how he went along with the plan. We've never made him feel that. From the time the kid hit the pavement, he was labeled bad. From the time they knew who his daddy was, he was labeled bad. From the time they knew his mom had an addiction, he was labeled fucked up. You know, and so on and so forth. And then we wonder why, how do people grow up and act like this and do things like this? Well, hell, take a look at the whole picture. And then ask yourself, what did you do to help him? What did you do? Nothing. I did not want anything to do with it because I was mad at him, because I didn't understand. But now I sit here before y'all, and it's like, yeah, all of us, you know, we failed him. We failed him. You know, as a whole, it's not this person, that person, or that person is dad, is mom, this, that. We, as a whole, as a family, failed him. You know what I'm saying?
Games provide comfort. It provides a family that you don't have. People become your brother. Some people become your father figure. They try to teach how to do things right. But, you know, we're knuckleheads. That's why we joined the gang. My name is Valentino Barraza. I've been doing Anthony Stanford since we was 14 or 15 years old, you know, and now to this day, we're still friends. It'd probably be still friends to the end. Anthony, as a gang member, his character was more of like super crazy. You know, it's like he was always ready, whether it was to rob somebody or steal some cars. I ain't never seen him scared nothing. I don't care what it was. If we was gonna go in a house full of people with guns, and he'll be the first one going through the house. You know, he was a crazy individual. very crazy, like unstable. Yeah, I feel bad for what happened and everything, you know, my condolences to their family and everything. But whenever you're committing a crime, whether it's home invasion or anything, you know, sometimes people don't want to leave no type of evidence and witnesses. I mean, when you go to war, there's casualties no matter what. Whether you find the enemy or just bystanders.
This crime ranked high on the list of being a very heinous crime. This lady was basically executed in her house. My name's Michael Johan. I'm a retired detective from the Independence, Missouri Police Department, and I was the lead detective on the Beverly Crowell homicide. Coming back here after 11 years triggers some emotions. There was no reason to kill her. I just felt like we had to get these people, because if you can kick a door open in the middle of the night and kill a little defenseless lady, who's next? Okay. Anthony, I think you still remember myself, Detective Ken Brewster. My name's Mike. Just to reiterate, I gave you your rights earlier today. You signed them, said you still remember those rights? You had right, you still have the right, because all those rights are still in effect.
Listen, the bottom line is this.
The bottom line, your ass is in deep doo-doo.
Okay, I don't know how, man. These people are implicating
You know what?
me.
Anthony obviously came in lying and denying everything.
Where is this evidence?
Well,
You know, we're not, like I said, we're not gonna go over all this evidence. We're not gonna go over.
Of a murder?
Here
Of
we
a
go.
murder? No, I don't think so. Ain't no murder, because I ain't did no murder.
Yeah, he did.
Oh,
Yeah, he did.
I'm already guilty in your eyes.
He was a very difficult person to interrogate.
Tell me you weren't there that night,
This
Anthony.
lady.
Really? Tell me you weren't there that night,
There where?
where the lady got killed.
Listen.
Tell me you weren't there.
I was not.
That's bullshit.
He's been in and out of prison. He knows the ropes. You're not going to be able to use emotional tactics with him and get him to feel sorry for the victim or anything like that. So we presented him with facts that kept showing him that we could prove he was the perpetrator of this homicide of Beverly Crowell.
We don't deal
Every
with
day, man.
Okay.
We don't deal with-
Okay, what can I do to prove to you that I'm giving you my word as a man? What do I have to do? I'm telling you, I'm not on no
Anthony,
bullshit.
you're asking questions.
Later on during the interrogation, he asked to see his girlfriend, and we told him that could be arranged. She had given a complete confession and had implicated Anthony in the murder. Then it became a bargaining tool that we used. We told him, you're not seeing her till you give us something. You're gonna have to tell us something about the murder of Beverly Crowell before we even allow you to see her. And that's when he seemed to let his guard down some, and he started giving us details about the murder that he had committed.
Who searched the house?
I did.
Okay. Then what?
And I knew it was the wrong house. I knew it, without a doubt.
And you shot her? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Yeah.
My thoughts about Anthony Standifer as a person is that he's a cold-blooded psychopathic killer. He executed Beverly. After he executed her, he got back in the car with his accomplices and said that chalk another one up on his belt. So there's a strong possibility that he's killed before.
Once we become older, you know what gives us joy? Seeing our nieces and our grandchildren and our children laugh with their children and their children's children. That is the greatest joy in the world. And when my nephew Anthony murdered that lady, he stole that from me. Anthony wanted to try to live that particular lifestyle. If you live that particular lifestyle, that's what that particular lifestyle brings. Violence brings violence. It's just that simple. It's not complicated. Several years after his brother is murdered by one of his friends, Anthony walks into a house, doesn't find a dope dealer, finds some old lady, and murders her. Murders beget murders. That lifestyle begets that lifestyle. Hopelessness, despair, not having a group or organization that says to you, we have a place for you amongst our ranks. And you can move up through the ranks. The more violent you are, the faster you move up in the ranks. But there's nothing cool about shooting people and murdering people and scaring children. Being a gang member is not like being a bus driver. It's not a safe occupation. I keep seeing these videos where they glamorize, I got a car and I'm gonna be a dope dealer and I got hookers and I got hoes. I got parties and I'm gonna do, okay. Right. You're gonna do all of that. Right. Okay. Good luck with that. I love my nephew. I love him today. Nothing will ever stop me from loving him. I don't care about his crazy father. I don't care about his crazy mother or any other of the crazies in his life. I love him. I will always love him. But what he did was heinous and unforgivable. Period.
When he made that choice, he not only affected Beverly, it affected her family, it affected him, it affected his family, friends, a ripple effect that just goes on and on and on. My name is Barbara Blue Draper. Beverly Sue Crowell was my twin sister. I was the oldest by 10 minutes. When we was growing up, we were basically together all the time. When you saw one, you saw the other one. It confused people and they didn't know which was which. There was a few times when we were older and dating, we switched on them, guys. That was fun. It's typical kids, you know. We were close. We've always lived in this town. I've lived here several years. And then the house across the street came up for sale, and she bought it and moved in. I would look out the window and she'd be out there in the yard putzing around doing something. I talked to her every day. She would call over here, invite me over for supper. Be quick, she'd say. And that's what happened that night. I'd been over there, she called me over for supper, and I went over. And we sat there and had supper, and we watched television. She told me she had 2 bananas laying on the kitchen counter, and I'll never forget them. They were dark. Said she's gonna make banana bread in the morning. And anyway, she watched me home, and we waved at each other at the front door. It's the last time I saw her. My thoughts on the person that did this, not very high. I don't think much of him. But I realize that, you know, he's a human being like the rest of us, but that doesn't excuse what he did, because he had a choice and he didn't have to make that choice. The values and morals that we were raised with, I think that teaching goes generation to generation, or it should, because you know, Mom and Dad's older, wiser, lived through more stuff. And kids and younger people need to listen to them. Because the kids, I think, are better off for it. It's all in the raising. It's all in the raising.
Drugs were taking a toll on my life. It's just another escape. That's all it is, escaping the reality of some chaos or pressure on your life. It's nobody's responsibility but your own. My name is Cassandra Jane Reed, and I am Anthony's mother. Me and Anthony, our relationship was wonderful, always making each other laugh. When I couldn't get out of bed, Anthony, at 5 years old, Anthony would bring me breakfast in bed. He got up on a chair, pulled a chair up to the stove, and scrambled me some eggs. And went outside and got some of those little yellow daisies, and put them on a tray, and brought it with. Just that thoughtful of me. Mama, you gonna be okay? He said, here. He said, you need to eat. I'm telling you. He's always been amazing to me. I've missed a lot of time with Anthony because I had to get away from here. And I couldn't take him with me. I can truly, honestly say, if I hadn't abandoned him when I did, when I left him with my family, because they always called him bad. And he knows I've not ever called him bad. So, I think that has a lot to do with it deep down. Okay, I'm through. I can't do this no more.
I don't have any hard feelings towards my family on the mistakes that they made in raising me. You know, I guess they just didn't, know any better. I don't want to solely put it on upbringing. That's definitely a strong contributing factor, but I have to take accountability, and because at that time when I committed this crime, I was 25 years old. So, I knew right from wrong, and I knew what I was doing was wrong. So I had a choice, and I chose not to do the right thing. How can I take another person's life unjustifiably for senselessly and no reason and not regret that? To think that I could kill a person, just because they saw my face is ludicrous. And I can't wrap my head around, like, what, excuse my language, what the hell was wrong with me? And to make those kind of decisions, it's just disgusting. I sincerely apologize, and I wish every day I wish I could go back and do something different.
My thoughts about Anthony Standifer as a person is that he's a cold-blooded psychopathic killer. He executed Beverly. After he executed her, he got back in the car with his accomplices and said that chalk another one up on his belt. So there's a strong possibility that he's killed before.
I have not killed anyone before. I think if that was true, then I would be convicted of another murder. I think that's just a way to paint a picture and try to put me in a box. Everybody that was involved, at that police department with the case, they all knew her because they worked with her. They said that she was like a mother to them. So, that's why I believe the detective has such strong feelings. I can't change opinions. What I can change is my behaviors by being, a good person, so to speak. But being in here, how do you know that I've become a good person? How do you know that I've changed? I can sit here and tell you that, but you will never know until I am released, right? And then I'm a productive member of society. I have to do, the right thing every day and just, and know that's good enough.
This is where I live. This is where I exist.
I swung right up over his shoulder into the side of his neck with that blade.
I was terrified. I just took somebody's life.
The scariest thing in the world is to know that somebody else is holding your life in their hands.
All that's holding my face together is metal plates.
I'm a very, very dangerous man.
I didn't say that I killed those people. I said that they were dead because of me.
I am who I am. Just to kill.
On a quiet summer morning in 1987, two families woke up expecting another ordinary day. There was no warning that before the sun set, two young lives would become the center of one of the Pacific Northwest's most haunting mysteries. A young couple would disappear. A vehicle would be found abandoned. Evidence would be scattered across different locations. And for more than 3 decades, one question would remain unanswered. Who killed Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg? The case would become a symbol of a nightmare every investigator fears, a crime with a trail of evidence, but no name attached to it. A cold case frozen in time, a mystery that refused to disappear. On November 18, 1987, 20-year-old Tanya Van Queilenborg and her 23-year-old boyfriend Jay Cook left British Columbia, Canada, for what appeared to be a simple overnight trip to the Seattle area. They were young, independent, and looking forward to spending time together. Their journey was not unusual. They crossed the border into Washington state, driving J.S. family's 1977 Ford van. They planned to pick up supplies and return home. To everyone who knew them, it was just another short road trip. But somewhere along that route, something went terribly wrong. The last confirmed moments of their lives would become fragments in a decades-long investigation. The couple's families would soon experience the kind of uncertainty that changes lives forever. The endless waiting, the unanswered phone calls, the desperate hope that maybe there was an explanation, maybe they had simply not been found yet. But as hours turned into days, the possibility that something much darker had happened began to emerge. The first major clue came when Jay and Tanya failed to return home. Their disappearance immediately raised concern among those who knew them. This was not normal behavior. There was no reason for them to vanish without contacting family or friends. No message, no explanation, no sign of where they had gone. Investigators began trying to reconstruct their movements, tracing the path of their trip and searching for anything that could explain their sudden disappearance. Then came the discovery that transformed a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. Jay and Tanya's van was found abandoned in the Seattle area. The vehicle that had carried them across the border was now sitting empty, creating more questions than answers. Inside and around the vehicle, investigators began collecting evidence, searching for clues that might reveal what happened. But the discovery of the van was only the beginning of a much larger tragedy. 2 days after the couple disappeared, authorities found Tanya's body in rural Snohomish County, Washington. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of investigators and her family. She had been murdered. The young woman who had left home expecting a normal trip was now at the center of a violent crime scene. The investigation immediately intensified. Detectives knew they were dealing with a serious offender. Tanya's death showed clear signs of violence, and investigators began working to understand the timeline, the location, and the circumstances surrounding her final moments. But before they could find answers about Tanya, another devastating discovery was made. Jay Cook's body was located in Skagit County, Washington. The two people who had disappeared together had been found separated by distance, victims of a crime that appeared deliberate and carefully concealed. The case now involved 2 homicide scenes, 2 victims, and a killer who had left behind a trail of questions. The community was shaken. People wanted answers. How could 2 young people disappear while traveling through a populated region? Who had encountered them? Had someone followed them? Was this a random attack, or had the killer known them? Investigators faced a difficult challenge. They had evidence, but they did not have a suspect. They had victims, but no clear motive. They had locations, but no complete story. Every homicide investigation depends on connecting pieces together: a witness, a vehicle, a weapon, a suspect, a mistake made by the person responsible. But in this case, the most important piece was missing: the identity of the person who committed the crime. Detectives worked through the evidence available at the time. They interviewed people connected to Jay and Tanya. They examined their movements and searched for anyone who may have seen something unusual during their trip. They looked for patterns and possibilities. But the investigation moved into uncertain territory. The case was filled with unanswered questions. A crime had occurred, but the person responsible had disappeared into the unknown. As the weeks passed, the initial urgency of the investigation slowly collided with a painful reality faced by many families of victims. Time does not always bring answers. Sometimes it only brings more distance between the crime and the hope of solving it. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became one of those cases, a case that remained open, a case that investigators never truly abandoned, even as years passed. The 1980s investigation was limited compared with the technology available decades later. DNA analysis was still in its early stages. Genetic genealogy did not exist. The databases and forensic tools that would eventually transform cold case investigations were not yet available. Evidence that could not reveal a suspect in 1987 would later become the key to unlocking the mystery. But for many years, the case remained silent. Jay and Tanya S. families were left carrying the weight of unanswered questions. The victims were remembered not as names in a police file, but as people whose lives had been cut short. Jay was described by those who knew him as a young man with a future ahead of him. Tanya was remembered as a young woman whose life ended far too soon. Their families waited for justice, knowing that somewhere there was someone who knew the truth. Meanwhile, investigators kept the case alive. Cold cases are rarely solved through one single moment. They are solved through persistence, through technology, and through the belief that time does not erase evidence. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became a haunting example of that principle. The killer had escaped identification. The years continued to pass. Seasons changed. Communities changed. Technology advanced. And somewhere in the evidence collected decades earlier, clues remained hidden. For more than 30 years, the question stayed the same. Who was responsible for the brutal murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg? The answer seemed buried in the past, but investigators would eventually discover that the past was not silent. It was waiting. A tiny piece of evidence preserved from 1987 would become the connection between an unsolved crime and a suspect no one had identified for decades. And after years of uncertainty, the cold case that had haunted investigators and families would finally move toward a shocking breakthrough. For more than 3 decades, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg remained a painful mystery that refused to fade away. The evidence collected in 1987 had told investigators that a violent crime had occurred, but it could not reveal the one thing they needed most: the identity of the person responsible. The case existed in a frustrating space familiar to many cold case detectives. The facts were known, the victims were known, the locations were known. But the connection between the crime and the person who committed it remained hidden. The investigation had reached a wall, and for years that wall seemed impossible to break. But behind every cold case is a story that continues long after the headlines disappear. Evidence does not age the same way memories do. Witnesses may forget details. People may move away. Communities may change. But physical evidence can remain. And in the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg investigation, one piece of evidence would eventually become the key that reopened a case that many feared might never be solved. When investigators first examined the crime scenes in 1987, they collected everything that could potentially reveal what happened. Forensic science at the time was far different from what it is today. DNA technology existed, but it was not yet the powerful investigative tool it would become decades later. The idea that a person could leave behind a genetic signature capable of identifying them years in the future was still beyond the reach of most investigations. Detectives worked with the tools available to them. They analyzed physical evidence. They followed leads. They interviewed possible witnesses. They attempted to reconstruct Jay and Tanya's final movements. But despite their efforts, the investigation produced no immediate arrest. The person responsible remained unknown. As the years passed, the case slowly moved from an active investigation into the category no family ever wants to hear, a cold case. Yet the murders never became forgotten. Investigators continued to revisit the evidence when new technology emerged. The case file remained open, waiting for a breakthrough. The victims' families continued living with the uncertainty that comes when justice is delayed. For them, the passage of time did not erase the loss. It only added more years without answers. Then, as forensic science entered a new era, cold cases across the world began experiencing unexpected breakthroughs. Advances in DNA analysis transformed investigations that had been considered nearly impossible to solve. Crimes from decades earlier were suddenly being reopened with new possibilities. Evidence once considered limited became valuable again. A single biological sample could provide a path that investigators in the 1980s could never have imagined. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case became part of this new chapter in criminal investigation. The evidence collected decades earlier was re-examined using modern techniques. Scientists and investigators looked again at what had been preserved from the original investigation. The question was no longer only what happened in 1987. The question became, what can today's technology reveal about what happened in 1987? This shift represented a dramatic change in the investigation. Instead of relying only on traditional detective work, investigators could now combine old evidence with new scientific methods. Cold cases were no longer simply forgotten files stored away in archives. They had become investigations waiting for the right technology to catch up. The breakthrough came through genetic genealogy, a method that uses DNA information and family connections to help identify possible relatives of an unknown person. This approach had already changed the way law enforcement looked at unsolved crimes. It allowed investigators to search for relationships hidden within genetic data and build connections that could eventually lead to an individual suspect. For the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg investigation, this technology provided a new direction. The DNA evidence from the crime was analyzed, and investigators began searching for links that had not been visible before. Instead of looking for a name immediately, they searched for a genetic trail. That trail would eventually lead them closer to the person who had escaped identification for decades. The investigation required patience and careful analysis. Genetic genealogy does not simply produce a suspect instantly. It involves studying family relationships, examining possible connections, and narrowing down possibilities. Investigators had to carefully evaluate information and compare it with the known facts of the case. Slowly, a picture began to form. The person who had remained unidentified since 1987 was no longer completely invisible. There was now a path forward. The investigation eventually focused on a man named William Earl Talbot Thestaker. His name had not appeared as a suspect during the original investigation. For decades, he had lived without being connected publicly to the murders. But modern forensic techniques changed that. Investigators began examining whether Talbot could be connected to the DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene. The possibility was extraordinary. A case that had remained unresolved since the 1980s was suddenly moving toward an answer. In 2018, authorities announced the arrest of William Earl Talbot, VN, in connection with the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. The announcement shocked many people who had followed the case for years. A mystery that had lasted more than 30 years had finally produced a suspect. The arrest represented more than a legal development. It represented the power of persistence and the continuing importance of preserving evidence. The case demonstrated that a crime can remain unsolved for decades and still have the potential to be solved. But the arrest also reopened painful memories. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the news brought a mixture of emotions. There was the relief of finally seeing movement in the case, but there was also the reality that nothing could bring their loved ones back. More than 30 years had passed since the day Jay and Tanya were killed. Their families had spent decades wondering if they would ever know who was responsible. Now, they finally had an answer. But an arrest was only the beginning of another chapter. Investigators still needed to present the evidence. Prosecutors needed to build the case. The legal process would determine whether the suspect would be held accountable. The decades-long mystery had finally reached a turning point, but the story was not over. The same evidence that had waited silently since 1987 would now become the center of a courtroom battle. The question that had haunted investigators for years had changed. It was no longer only, who killed Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg? Now the question became, could the evidence prove beyond doubt that the man arrested after 30 years was the person responsible? As the case moved forward, the world watched one of the most remarkable cold case investigations in modern history unfold. A crime that had survived decades of uncertainty was finally approaching its moment of truth. The silence surrounding Jay and Tanya's deaths was beginning to break, and the evidence preserved from the past was preparing to tell its story. For 30 years, the name William Earl Talbot, vis Ethan, had never appeared in the investigation into the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. His life existed completely separate from the case file that had haunted detectives in Washington state for decades. While investigators searched through evidence, followed leads, and revisited unanswered questions, the person they were looking for remained unknown. The crime had become one of those cold cases that seemed trapped in the past, a case where the victims had been identified. The tragedy had been documented, but the person responsible remained beyond reach. Then modern science changed everything. The same evidence that had failed to provide an answer in 1987 suddenly became the bridge between the past and the present. A new era of forensic investigation had arrived, and with it came the possibility that even decades-old crimes could finally reveal their secrets. When authorities arrested William Earl Talbot Sedetin in 2018, the announcement sent shockwaves through the communities connected to the case. A mystery that had lasted for more than 30 years was no longer a mystery. Investigators believed they had found the man responsible for one of Washington's most disturbing unsolved crimes. But that the path to that arrest was not simple. It was built from years of persistence, technological advancement, and a piece of evidence that had remained untouched since the original investigation. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg had begun as a desperate search for two missing young people. It had transformed into a double homicide investigation. Then it became a cold case. Now it had become something else entirely, a test of whether modern science could finally deliver justice for victims whose families had waited decades for answers. The breakthrough began with DNA. During the original investigation in 1987, investigators collected biological evidence connected to the crime. At the time, forensic DNA analysis was still developing. The ability to compare genetic material and identify individuals was not nearly as advanced as it is today. The evidence existed, but the technology needed to fully understand it had not yet arrived. For years, that evidence remained a silent witness. It held information, but investigators could not unlock it. Decades later, advances in forensic science created new possibilities. Law enforcement agencies began using genetic genealogy to investigate cold cases. Unlike traditional DNA databases that search for direct matches, genetic genealogy can identify relationships between individuals by analyzing shared genetic information. It opened a completely new investigative path. Instead of asking, "Who is this person?" investigators could begin with another question: who are this person's relatives? That approach had already helped solve other long unsolved crimes, and now investigators turned their attention to the evidence preserved from the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case. Scientists analyzed the DNA connected to the crime and began looking for genetic connections. The process required careful examination. Investigators had to build a family tree from genetic information and determine which individuals could potentially be connected to the unknown DNA profile. Each connection had to be studied, verified, and compared against the facts of the case. It was not a simple search. It was a slow process of elimination, research, and confirmation. Eventually, investigators identified a possible family connection that led them toward William Earl Talbot II. The discovery was a major turning point. A man who had remained outside the investigation for 3 decades was now being examined as a potential suspect. Detectives began gathering additional evidence to determine whether the genetic connection was accurate. The investigation moved from possibility toward confirmation. Authorities then conducted further DNA testing, comparing samples associated with Talbot to the evidence from the 1987 crime. The results became the foundation of the case against him. After years of uncertainty, investigators believed they had finally connected a suspect to the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. The arrest that followed represented one of the most significant moments in the history of the case. William Earl Talbot, the NN, was taken into custody in 2018. For the families of the victims, the announcement brought an emotional moment that they had waited decades to experience. The question that had followed them for years finally had an answer. The person accused of taking Jay and Tanya's lives had been identified, but the arrest also marked the beginning of a new struggle, proving the case in court. An arrest does not determine guilt. It begins the legal process where evidence must be presented, challenged, and examined. Prosecutors would need to show that the DNA evidence and other investigative findings connected Talbot to the crime. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the accusations and question the evidence. The courtroom would become the place where a decades-old mystery would finally be examined in full. As the case moved forward, investigators reviewed the events of 1987 with new understanding. They looked back at the evidence, the locations, and the timeline of events surrounding Jay and Tanya's final days. Every detail collected decades earlier now carried new importance. What had once been fragments without a clear explanation were now part of a larger picture. The investigation showed how dramatically criminal investigations had changed over time. In 1987, detectives depended heavily on traditional methods, interviews, physical evidence, witness accounts, and investigative experience. In 2018, they combined those methods with advanced genetic technology. The past and the present had come together. The evidence from one era was interpreted through the tools of another. The case became an example of how cold cases can remain active even after decades of silence. For many investigators, the arrest of Talbot represented something larger than one case. It demonstrated that time does not always protect those responsible for violent crimes. Evidence can survive. Technology can evolve, and investigations can return with new strength years after the original crime occurred. But behind the science and the headlines were two victims whose lives had been interrupted. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg were not simply names connected to a famous cold case. They were young people with families, relationships, and futures that were taken away. The investigation's ultimate purpose was not only to identify a suspect, it was to seek accountability for two lives lost. The years of waiting had been incredibly difficult for everyone connected to the case. The families had lived through uncertainty, wondering if the truth would ever emerge. Investigators had carried the responsibility of an unfinished case, and the community had remembered a crime that seemed impossible to solve. The arrest of William Earl Talbot then changed the direction of that story. A case that had remained frozen for 30 years was moving again. But the final chapter would not be written by the arrest alone. The evidence would have to stand before a jury. The prosecution would have to explain how a decades-old crime was finally solved, and the defense would have to challenge the conclusions reached by investigators. After 30 years of questions, the world was finally approaching the moment when the evidence from 1987 would receive its ultimate test. A cold case had found a suspect. A silent investigation had found a voice. And the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg was about to enter the courtroom, where decades of unanswered questions would finally face judgment. The arrest of William Earl Talbot in 2018 marked a moment investigators had waited more than 30 years to see. A case that had remained frozen since 1987 was suddenly moving again. The evidence collected decades earlier was no longer just a reminder of an unsolved tragedy. It had become the foundation of a criminal case. But an arrest was only the beginning. For the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg, the announcement brought a long-awaited answer to a question that had followed them for decades. Yet for the justice system, the most important question still remained. Could prosecutors prove that the man arrested after 30 years was responsible for the murders? The courtroom would become the place where a decades-old mystery would be examined, piece by piece. Every piece of evidence mattered. Every scientific conclusion mattered. Every decision made by investigators, from the original crime scene in 1987 to the modern DNA analysis decades later, would now be placed under intense examination. The story that had remained unfinished for so long would finally be presented in front of a jury. When prosecutors prepared the case against William Earl Talbot, they focused heavily on the forensic evidence that had connected him to the crime. The most important element was the DNA evidence. The breakthrough had not come from a new witness suddenly appearing or a confession that revealed the truth. It came from science, a genetic connection that investigators in 1987 could never have created had eventually led them to a suspect. The prosecution argued that the DNA evidence linked Talbot to the crime scene and demonstrated that he was the person responsible for the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. They explained how the genetic genealogy process helped identify him after decades of uncertainty. The investigation showed how technology had transformed an old case into a new criminal investigation. But the defense challenged the prosecution's conclusions. Like any criminal case, the accusations had to be tested. The defense questioned the reliability and interpretation of the evidence, reminding the jury that an arrest and an accusation were not the same as proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial would require jurors to carefully consider not only what the evidence showed, but also what it meant. The courtroom became a meeting point between two different eras of investigation. On one side was the world of 1987, when detectives searched for answers using the tools available at the time. On the other side was the world of modern forensic science, where genetic information could reveal connections that had remained invisible for decades. The prosecution walked the jury through the timeline of the case. In November 1987, Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg had traveled from British Columbia into Washington state. They had planned a short trip, but they never returned home. Their disappearance led to a search that quickly became a homicide investigation after their bodies were discovered. The locations connected to the crime were revisited through testimony and evidence. Investigators explained how the original investigation unfolded and how the evidence collected at the time became crucial decades later. The jury was shown that the case had not been solved through a single discovery, but through years of preservation, analysis, and determination. The emotional weight of the case was impossible to ignore. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the trial was not only about evidence and legal arguments. It was about finally facing the person accused of destroying their lives. More than 30 years had passed since they lost their loved ones. The passage of time had changed everything around them, but the pain of the murders remained. The victims' memories were central to the case. Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg were remembered as young people whose futures had been taken away. They were not defined by the crime that ended their lives. They were remembered as family members, friends, and individuals who had mattered to the people around them. As the trial continued, prosecutors emphasized the significance of the DNA evidence. The jury heard how genetic genealogy had helped investigators identify Talbot as a potential suspect. The method represented one of the most important developments in modern cold case investigations. Crimes once considered impossible to solve were being reopened because evidence that had waited silently for years could finally be understood. The case attracted national attention because it represented a new chapter in criminal investigation. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg had happened at a time when DNA technology was limited. 30 years later, the same evidence became powerful enough to identify a suspect. It was a dramatic example of how science could reach backward through time. But behind the technology was a human story. The investigation was not only about DNA profiles and forensic methods. It was about two families who had lived with uncertainty. It was about detectives who refused to let the case disappear. It was about a community that remembered a crime that had remained unsolved for generations. The trial forced everyone involved to confront the events of 1987 again. The evidence that had remained silent for decades was finally being discussed publicly. The names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg were no longer connected only to an unsolved mystery. Their case was now moving through the justice system. The prosecutionist's argument centered on one central idea, that modern science had finally revealed what happened decades earlier. The defense argued that the evidence needed careful examination and that the jury had to make its decision based only on what was proven in court. As the proceedings continued, the world watched a historic cold case reach its final stage. Many unsolved crimes remain mysteries forever. Many families never receive answers. But the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Queilenborg case had reached a point few believed possible. The person investigators had searched for since 1987 was now sitting before a judge and jury. The courtroom became the final chapter of a journey that began with a missing couple, continued through years of unanswered questions, and was transformed by a scientific breakthrough. The evidence collected decades earlier had survived long enough to tell its story. For investigators, this case represented perseverance. For forensic experts, it represented the power of innovation. For the families of Jay and Tanya, it represented the possibility of justice after decades of waiting. But the most important moment was still ahead. The jury would soon decide whether the evidence presented in court was enough to prove that William Earl Talbot II was responsible for the murders that had haunted the Pacific Northwest for more than 30 years. A cold case had finally reached the courtroom. The questions that had remained unanswered for decades were no longer hidden in old files. They were now being examined under the highest standard of justice. And after 30 years of silence, the final answer was about to emerge. For more than 30 years, the names Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg represented a question that refused to disappear. A young couple had vanished during what should have been a simple trip. Their bodies were later found in separate locations. An investigation began. Evidence was collected. Detectives searched for answers. But year after year passed without an arrest. The case became one of those haunting cold cases where the victims were remembered, the crime was never forgotten, and the person responsible remained unidentified. Then, after decades of silence, modern forensic science brought the investigation back into the spotlight. The arrest of William Earl Talbot, the physician, transformed the case from an unsolved mystery into a courtroom battle where every piece of evidence would be examined. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors presented the story of a crime that had remained unresolved since 1987. They described how Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg left British Columbia and traveled into Washington state, never knowing that their journey would end in tragedy. Their disappearance had created fear and uncertainty among their families. Their deaths had shocked communities on both sides of the border, and for decades, investigators searched for the missing connection between the evidence and the person responsible. The prosecution's case centered around the idea that the answer had always been present in the evidence. The technology simply had not existed yet to reveal it. The DNA recovered during the original investigation had become the foundation of the case against Talbot. What investigators could not identify in 1987 became the key decades later. The courtroom heard how genetic genealogy had changed the investigation. Traditional DNA databases had limitations. They were powerful when a direct match existed, but they could not always identify someone whose information was not already available. Genetic genealogy created a different path. By examining genetic relationships and tracing connections through family lines, investigators could move closer to identifying an unknown person. This method required patience and precision. It was not a simple search that produced an immediate answer. Investigators had to analyze genetic information, examine possible relatives, and carefully determine whether those connections could lead to a specific individual. Every possibility had to be evaluated. Every conclusion had to be supported. Eventually, that process led investigators to William Earl Talbot II's. The connection was unexpected. For decades, he had not been identified as a suspect in the murders. His name had not been part of the original investigation, but the genetic evidence created a path that investigators had never been able to follow before. After identifying Talbot as a possible suspect, authorities gathered additional evidence. They compared genetic material and continued building the case. The investigation that had remained inactive for so long suddenly became one of the most closely watched cold case breakthroughs in the country. The defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. They argued that the jury had to carefully consider every detail and not simply accept the conclusions presented by investigators. The defense questioned the reliability of the evidence and reminded jurors that the burden of proof belonged entirely to the prosecution. The trial became a debate between uncertainty and scientific evidence. The defense pointed to the passage of time and the challenges involved in investigating a crime more than 3 decades old. The prosecution argued that time had not weakened the case because the most important evidence had been preserved. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the trial represented a moment they had waited years to reach. They had lived through the pain of not knowing. They had experienced the frustration of a case that seemed impossible to solve. Every anniversary of the murders brought back memories of the lives that had been taken away. A courtroom cannot erase decades of grief. It cannot restore the future that Jay and Tanya lost, but it can provide answers. It can establish accountability. It can transform a painful mystery into a documented truth. Throughout the proceedings, the victims remained at the center of the story. Jay Cook was remembered as a young man whose life was interrupted. Tanya Van Quedlinburg was remembered as a young woman with hopes and dreams that ended far too soon. Their families had spent decades waiting for justice, and the trial represented the possibility that their long search might finally end. The case also became an important moment in the history of cold case investigations. It demonstrated how technology had changed the landscape of law enforcement. Crimes that once appeared unsolvable could now be reopened. Evidence collected decades earlier could become the starting point for a new investigation. Across the United States and around the world, investigators began looking differently at old cases. Files that had remained untouched for years were reviewed again. Evidence that once seemed limited was reconsidered. The success of genetic genealogy showed that time was no longer always an advantage for those who committed violent crimes. But the science alone did not solve the case. Behind the breakthrough were investigators who continued searching, forensic specialists who analyzed the evidence, and families who never stopped hoping that answers would come. The trial represented the final stage of a journey that began in 1987. It had started with a missing couple and ended with a suspect identified through technology that had not existed when the crime occurred. The distance between those two moments was measured not only in years, but in decades of uncertainty. As the jury considered the evidence, they faced the responsibility of deciding whether the prosecution had proven its case. The decision would determine whether the man accused of the murders would be held accountable. For the public, the case had become a symbol of something larger. It was about the power of science, the persistence of investigators, and the possibility that even the oldest mysteries could eventually be solved. But for the families of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg, it was much more personal. It was about two people whose lives mattered. Two people whose deaths had left an empty space that could never be filled. After 30 years, the question that had haunted investigators finally had a possible answer. But justice would depend on what happened inside the courtroom. The evidence had brought a suspect forward. Now it had to convince a jury. The world waited as the final pieces of one of the most remarkable cold case investigations in modern history came together. A mystery that had survived 3 decades was approaching its conclusion. The silence surrounding Jay and Tanya's deaths was finally being replaced by testimony, evidence, and a search for the truth that had lasted a lifetime. For 30 years, the evidence connected to the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg remained locked inside an old case file. It carried the weight of a tragedy that had never received a final answer. Detectives had searched, families had waited, communities had remembered, but the person responsible remained unknown. Then a new generation of investigators returned to the evidence with tools that did not exist when the crime first happened. The breakthrough was not the result of a forgotten witness suddenly coming forward or a dramatic confession revealing the truth. It was the result of science uncovering a connection that had been hidden for decades. But as the case entered the courtroom, the question was no longer whether investigators had found a suspect. The question was whether they had found the person responsible. The trial of William Earl Talbot Tisset represented the final stage of a journey that had begun on a quiet November day in 1987. The prosecution presented the jury with a story that stretched across decades, connecting a violent crime seen from the past with modern forensic technology. They argued that the DNA evidence recovered during the original investigation was the link between Talbot and the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. The jury heard how the investigation had evolved over time. In 1987, detectives worked with the resources available to them. They examined physical evidence, interviewed people, and attempted to reconstruct what had happened to the missing couple. But without modern DNA technology, the evidence could not identify a suspect. Years later, advances in forensic science changed everything. The same evidence that had once reached a dead end became the foundation of a new investigation. Genetic genealogy provided investigators with a method to search through family connections and identify possible relatives of the unknown DNA profile. It was a process that required careful research and verification, but it eventually created a path leading to William Earl Talbot Tisset. The prosecution explained that the DNA connection was not simply a coincidence. They presented evidence that they believed linked Talbot directly to the crime. The case represented a new era in criminal investigation, where evidence collected decades earlier could be analyzed with technology that had transformed the possibilities of justice. But the defense argued that the jury needed to examine the evidence carefully. They questioned the conclusions drawn from the investigation and challenged the reliability of the methods used to identify Talbot. The defense reminded the jury that even advanced science must be evaluated within the standards of the legal system. The courtroom became a place where two different worlds collided. One was the world of 1987, when 2 young people disappeared and investigators struggled to find answers. The other was the world of modern forensic science, where genetic information could reveal connections across generations. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the proceedings represented an emotional turning point. For years, they had lived with unanswered questions. They had experienced the pain of anniversaries without justice and the uncertainty of not knowing who had taken their loved ones away. Now, decades later, they finally had the opportunity to hear the evidence presented in court. But the trial was not only about what happened in 1987, it was also about the lives that existed before the crime. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg were young people with families, friends, and plans for the future. Their story began long before they became victims of a crime. The investigation and trial were attempts to honor those lives by seeking the truth. As testimony continued, the prosecution described the significance of the evidence recovered from the original investigation. Every detail collected decades earlier became important. Items that had once been stored away as part of an unresolved case were now being examined through a new scientific understanding. The case attracted attention because it represented one of the most significant uses of genetic genealogy in solving a decades-old homicide. It showed how investigators could combine traditional detective work with modern technology. The breakthrough became part of a larger movement in law enforcement, where old cases were reopened and previously impossible questions were being answered. But the process was not without controversy. Genetic genealogy raised new discussions about privacy, databases, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting personal information. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case became part of that larger conversation because it demonstrated both the power and the complexity of this emerging investigative tool. For investigators, however, the focus remained on the victims and the search for justice. The goal was not simply to solve a mystery. It was to provide answers to families who had waited for decades. The passage of time had created enormous challenges. Memories changed. People moved. Circumstances evolved. But the evidence remained. That evidence became the connection between the crime scene of 1987 and the courtroom decades later. As the jury listened, they had to consider the full picture. The case was not based on a single moment. It was built from years of investigation, scientific analysis, and careful examination. The prosecution argued that all of those pieces pointed toward one conclusion. The defense argued that the evidence required closer scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to capture public attention. Many people saw it as a reminder that unsolved crimes do not always remain unsolved forever. The arrest of Talbot showed that cold cases can experience unexpected breakthroughs, even after decades have passed. The families of Jay and Tanya had waited more than 30 years for this moment. They had carried memories of their loved ones while also carrying the burden of unanswered questions. The trial represented a chance for those questions to finally receive an answer. But even as the case moved toward a verdict, one reality remained impossible to ignore. No courtroom decision could undo the tragedy that occurred in 1987. No evidence presentation could restore the future that Jay and Tanya lost. Justice could provide accountability, but it could not erase the pain. The significance of the case extended beyond one courtroom. It became a story about time, technology, and determination. It showed that evidence can survive. It showed that investigations can continue even when years pass without progress. And it showed that the victims of cold cases are never truly forgotten. After decades of silence, the evidence had finally spoken. The question that had haunted investigators since 1987 was now in the hands of the jury. The search for the truth had crossed generations, moved through changing technology, and survived years of uncertainty. Now came the moment that would determine the final chapter of one of Washington State's most haunting murder investigations. After 30 years of waiting, the world was about to learn whether the evidence would deliver the justice that Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg's families had hoped for since the day their lives changed forever. The courtroom had become the place where 30 years of uncertainty were finally confronted. Every piece of evidence, every investigative decision, and every unanswered question connected to the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg was now being examined under the weight of a criminal trial. For decades, their families had waited for this moment. For decades, investigators had carried the memory of a case that seemed impossible to solve. Now, the evidence that had remained silent since 1987 was being presented in front of a jury. The prosecution's argument was built around a simple but powerful idea. The truth had been there all along. It had been preserved in the evidence collected after the murders. The only thing missing had been the technology capable of revealing it. The DNA evidence, combined with modern genetic genealogy, had created a path that eventually led investigators to William Earl Talbot Thethoteka. The jury heard how the investigation had changed over time. In the late 1980s, detectives faced the limitations of forensic science. They could collect evidence, document crime scenes, and conduct interviews, but the tools needed to identify an unknown person through genetic information were not yet available. The evidence existed, but its full meaning remained hidden. Years later, forensic science advanced dramatically. DNA analysis became more sophisticated. Genetic genealogy became a new investigative method. Crimes that had remained unsolved for decades began receiving renewed attention. Investigators across the country started looking back at old evidence with new possibilities. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case became one of those investigations transformed by modern science. The evidence from 1987 was reviewed again, not because investigators had forgotten the case, but because they finally had a new way to approach it. The genetic genealogy process eventually led investigators toward Talbot, but identifying a potential suspect was only one step. Investigators still needed to establish whether the evidence connected him to the crime. They needed to build a case strong enough to survive the demands of a courtroom. During the trial, prosecutors presented the DNA evidence as the central piece of their argument. They explained how the genetic information connected Talbot to the crime scene and why they believed it demonstrated his involvement. The prosecution emphasized that this was not a random discovery, but the result of a careful investigation that combined science with traditional police work. The defense challenged that interpretation. They argued that the jury needed to look closely at the evidence and avoid reaching conclusions simply because the case had attracted public attention. They questioned aspects of the investigation and emphasized that the burden of proof remained with the prosecution. The trial became a battle between two interpretations of the same evidence. The prosecution saw the DNA as the final answer to a 30-year mystery. The defense argued that the evidence needed to be examined with caution and skepticism. But beyond the legal arguments, the emotional reality of the case remained. The courtroom was not just a place where evidence was presented. It was a place where the memories of two young people were brought back into focus. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg were not remembered only because of the way they died. They were remembered because of the lives they lived before the tragedy. They had families who loved them. They had friends who knew them. They had futures that disappeared in a moment of violence. For their loved ones, the trial represented more than a search for a conviction. It represented a chance to finally understand what had happened. It represented the possibility of closing a chapter that had remained open for decades. Cold cases create a unique kind of pain. There is grief, but there is also uncertainty. Families of victims often describe the difficulty of living without answers. They remember the person they lost while wondering if the truth will ever emerge. In the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case, that uncertainty lasted for more than 30 years. The arrest of Talbot changed that. It showed families across the world that time does not always protect those responsible for violent crimes. It demonstrated that evidence can survive beyond the limits of one generation of investigators. The case also highlighted the evolution of criminal investigation itself. The detectives who worked on the case in 1987 could not have imagined the tools that would eventually help solve it. The forensic specialists who analyzed the evidence decades later were building on the work of those earlier investigators. It was a chain that stretched across time. One group collected the evidence, another group preserved it, another group analyzed it with new technology. Each step brought the case closer to an answer. As the trial continued, the jury was asked to consider the complete picture. They had to weigh the DNA evidence, the investigative process, and the arguments presented by both sides. Their decision would determine whether the person accused of the murders would be held legally responsible. The significance of the trial reached far beyond Washington state. Around the world, people followed the case because it represented something many families of victims hope for: the possibility that an unsolved crime may one day be solved. The phrase cold case often suggests something abandoned or forgotten, but the investigation into the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg showed a different reality. A cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes it is an investigation waiting for the right moment, the right technology, or the right discovery. The breakthrough in this case became a symbol of that possibility. It showed that decades can pass without eliminating the chance for justice. It showed that evidence can remain powerful even after years of silence. But as the jury prepared to make its decision, the emotional weight of the case remained impossible to ignore. A verdict could determine legal responsibility, but it could not return Jay and Tanya to their families. It could not undo the pain that began in 1987. What it could do was provide an answer. It could replace uncertainty with a conclusion. It could give two families something they had waited more than 30 years to receive, a final judgment. The courtroom grew closer to that moment. After decades of searching, the investigation had reached its final test. The evidence had traveled from a crime scene in 1987 to a courtroom years later. The voices of investigators, forensic experts, and family members had all contributed to the story. Now, the decision belonged to the jury. The question that had haunted the case since the beginning was finally about to be answered. Had the man identified through modern forensic science truly been the person responsible for the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg? After 30 years of mystery, the final chapter was waiting to be written. The final stage of the trial brought the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg case to the moment everyone had been waiting for. After more than 30 years of unanswered questions, years of investigation, and a breakthrough made possible by modern forensic science, the evidence was now in the hands of the jury. The courtroom had become the place where a decades-old mystery would finally be measured against the highest standard of justice. The question was no longer whether investigators had found a suspect. They had. The question was whether the evidence proved that William Earl Talbot, the Ent, was the person responsible for the brutal murders that had haunted two families and an entire community since 1987. The prosecution returned again and again to the central piece of the case, DNA evidence. They argued that the genetic connection discovered through modern analysis was the key that unlocked a mystery that had remained unsolved for generations. The evidence, they said, created a direct connection between Talbot and the crime. It was the result of decades of scientific progress transforming an old investigation into a new one. For prosecutors, the case represented the power of persistence. They emphasized that the investigation had never truly ended. The evidence had been preserved. The case file had remained open. When technology changed, investigators returned to the evidence with new possibilities. What had been impossible in 1987 had become achievable decades later. The defense continued to challenge the prosecution's interpretation. They reminded jurors that even powerful evidence must be carefully evaluated. They argued that the case required more than a compelling story. It required proof. The jury's responsibility was not to decide whether the case was interesting or whether the arrest was surprising. Their responsibility was to determine whether the evidence met the legal standard required for a conviction. The trial represented a broader conversation about the role of forensic science in modern criminal investigations. Genetic genealogy had changed the way law enforcement approached cold cases. It had helped investigators identify suspects in crimes that had remained unsolved for decades. But it also required careful use because every investigation involving genetic information carried questions about accuracy, interpretation, and privacy. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg case became one of the most closely watched examples of this new era. It demonstrated how evidence collected in the past could suddenly become powerful again. It showed that time could pass, technology could evolve, and yet the search for answers could continue. As the jury considered the evidence, the story of Jay and Tanya remained at the center of the proceedings. Their names were not just part of a criminal case. They represented two lives that ended far too soon. Jay Cook was a young man whose family expected him to continue building his future. Tanya Van Quillenborg was a young woman whose life was filled with possibilities that would never happen. Their trip in November 1987 was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to end with them returning home. Instead, it became the beginning of one of Washington State's most painful mysteries. The passage of time created a unique challenge for everyone connected to the case. Investigators from the original homicide investigation had retired or moved on. Witness memories had changed. Technology had transformed, but the victims remained the same. The tragedy that happened in 1987 still mattered decades later. For the families, the trial represented the end of a long period of uncertainty. The pain of losing a loved one is devastating on its own, but the absence of answers creates another layer of suffering. Not knowing who was responsible meant that every possibility remained open. Every unanswered question continued to exist. The arrest of Talbot brought a major change. It gave the families an explanation. It gave investigators a suspect. It gave the justice system an opportunity to examine the evidence. But the emotional journey was complicated. After so many years, the world around the families had changed. Children had grown up. Generations had passed. The victims' families had lived through decades without the resolution they hoped for. The return of the case to the public spotlight brought back memories that had never completely disappeared. The jury's decision would determine how the case would be remembered. A guilty verdict would mean that the justice system had accepted the prosecution's argument and held Talbot responsible. An acquittal would mean the evidence had not reached the required standard. Either outcome would become part of the historical record of one of the most remarkable cold cases in modern times. The courtroom atmosphere reflected the importance of the moment. A case that had begun with a missing couple moved through years of investigation and eventually became a symbol of forensic advancement was approaching its conclusion. The prosecution emphasized the connection between the evidence and the timeline. They argued that the DNA evidence was not simply a discovery, but the result of careful scientific analysis. They presented the investigation as a journey from uncertainty to identification. The defense maintained that the jury had to remain cautious. They argued that the passage of decades and the complexity of genetic evidence required careful consideration. For observers around the world, the case had become a powerful reminder that cold cases are not only about the past, they are about the present. They are about families still waiting, investigators still searching, and evidence still holding information. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg also became part of a larger shift in law enforcement. Their case showed how technology could reopen investigations and provide answers that once seemed impossible. It demonstrated why preserving evidence matters. It demonstrated why investigators continue working on cases even when years pass without progress. The phrase cold case solved often appears in headlines as if the solution happened suddenly. But the reality is usually different. Behind every breakthrough are years of unanswered questions, careful investigation, scientific advancement, and people who refuse to stop searching. The resolution of this case was not created in one moment. It was built over decades. The evidence from 1987 had survived long enough to tell its story. The investigators who reopened the case had followed that evidence to a suspect. The courtroom had examined the arguments from both sides. Now, the final decision belonged to 12 members of the jury. After 30 years, the mystery surrounding Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg was no longer hidden in an old file. It had reached its final confrontation. The world waited for the verdict. Families waited. Investigators waited. And after decades of silence, the answer that everyone had been searching for was finally about to arrive. After decades of uncertainty, the moment that families, investigators, and the public had waited for finally arrived. The courtroom that had become the center of a 30-year-old mystery was preparing to deliver its decision. For years, the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg had represented one of the most painful unanswered questions in the Pacific Northwest. Now, after a breakthrough made possible by modern DNA technology, the case had reached the final stage of the justice system. The jury had heard the evidence. They had listened to the arguments. They had examined the scientific findings and the explanations from both sides. Their task was not to decide whether the story was tragic. Everyone already knew it was. Their task was to determine whether the prosecution had proven that William Earl Talbot, the decedent, was responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. The case had traveled an extraordinary path. In 1987, investigators were faced with a nightmare scenario. 2 young people disappeared during a short trip. Their vehicle was found abandoned. Their bodies were later discovered in different locations. The evidence showed that a violent crime had taken place, but the person responsible remained unknown. For years, detectives worked through the available information. They followed leads that did not produce answers. They examined evidence that could not yet reveal its secrets. The investigation slowed, but it never disappeared completely. The case remained open, waiting for the moment when science could catch up. That moment came decades later. The use of genetic genealogy transformed the investigation. It represented a new chapter in the history of criminal justice. Evidence that had once seemed limited became a pathway to identification. DNA, preserved from the original investigation, provided investigators with a connection that had not existed before. The discovery of a possible genetic link eventually led authorities to William Earl Talbot Zaent. The arrest shocked many people who had followed the case. After 30 years, the unknown person connected to the murders finally had a name. But the trial was where that discovery had to be tested. The prosecution presented the DNA evidence as the centerpiece of its case. They explained how the genetic information connected Talbot to the crime and argued that the scientific findings confirmed his involvement. They told the jury that the answer had not been created by speculation, but by evidence that had survived since 1987. The defense took a different approach. They urged jurors to examine every detail carefully. They challenged the prosecutionist's interpretation and emphasized that a conviction could only happen if the evidence met the strict requirements of the law. The jury faced a difficult responsibility. They had to consider evidence from a crime that occurred more than 30 years earlier. They had to evaluate technology that had not existed when the investigation began. They had to decide whether the connection between the evidence and the accused man was strong enough to remove reasonable doubt. The decision carried enormous emotional weight. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the case represented decades of pain and waiting. They had spent years wondering whether they would ever know who was responsible. They had lived through anniversaries marked by unanswered questions. They had carried memories of their loved ones while waiting for justice. The verdict would not change the past. It would not bring Jay and Tanya back. But it would determine whether the person accused of taking their lives would be held accountable. When the jury returned, the courtroom waited for the final answer. William Earl Talbot Zaent was found guilty of the murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg. The verdict represented the conclusion of a journey that had lasted more than 30 years. A case that had once seemed impossible to solve had finally reached a resolution. Investigators had identified the person responsible. The evidence had been accepted by the jury. The families had received the answer they had waited so long to hear. The reaction to the verdict reflected the significance of the case. It was not only about one criminal investigation. It was about the possibility of solving crimes that had remained unanswered for decades. The case became one of the most recognized examples of genetic genealogy being used to solve a cold case. It showed how law enforcement agencies could combine traditional investigation methods with advanced science. It demonstrated that evidence collected decades earlier could still play a decisive role. But behind the headlines and the scientific breakthrough was a story about loss. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became known around the world because of the circumstances of their deaths. Yet for their families, they were more than victims in a famous case. They were loved ones whose lives had been interrupted. They were people with personalities, dreams, and relationships. The conclusion of the trial did not erase the tragedy. Justice could provide accountability, but it could not restore what had been taken away. For investigators, however, the verdict represented the end of a long pursuit. It confirmed the importance of preserving evidence and continuing to investigate cases even when years pass without answers. The detectives who worked on the case across different generations had contributed to the final outcome. The case also changed the way many people viewed cold cases. It challenged the belief that time always protects criminals. It showed that technology could uncover truths hidden for decades. Across the country, investigators began looking again at old evidence. Files that had remained unsolved were reconsidered. Biological evidence that had once seemed impossible to use became valuable. Families who had lost hope began wondering whether their own cases might one day receive the same breakthrough. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became a powerful reminder of the importance of patience and persistence in criminal investigations. The case also raised important discussions about the future of forensic science. Genetic genealogy had proven its ability to solve difficult crimes, but it also created questions about privacy, ethics, and the responsible use of genetic information. The debate continued as law enforcement agencies explored how this technology should be used. But for the families connected to this case, the most important fact was simple. After more than 30 years, the person responsible had been identified and convicted. A mystery that began in 1987 had finally reached its conclusion. The abandoned vehicle, the unanswered questions, the years of investigation, and the evidence that waited silently had all become part of a story that demonstrated one powerful truth. Some cases are never truly forgotten. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg had remained unsolved for decades, but the search for justice never completely ended. And in the end, the past returned with the answer that investigators had been searching for since the beginning. The cold case was no longer cold. The names of Jay and Tanya were no longer connected only to an unsolved tragedy. They were connected to a story of perseverance, science, and a decades-long pursuit of justice. The verdict brought an end to one of the longest and most closely followed murder investigations in Washington state history, but the impact of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case extended far beyond the walls of a courtroom. More than 30 years had passed between the night the two young people disappeared and the moment a jury finally delivered justice. In that time, the world changed, technology changed, investigative methods changed, but the pain experienced by two families remained frozen in the moment their loved ones never came home. For decades, the case had carried the weight of uncertainty. It was not only a murder investigation, it was a reminder of the unanswered questions that surround families of victims when a crime remains unsolved. Every year that passed represented another year without an arrest, another year without knowing who was responsible, another year wondering whether justice would ever come. The conviction of William Earl Talbot Venison changed the story. The mystery that had remained open since 1987 finally had a conclusion in the eyes of the justice system. But the path to that conclusion was one of patience, persistence, and technological advancement. The case became one of the most important examples of how genetic genealogy could transform cold case investigations. Before this technology existed, investigators faced a familiar problem. They could have evidence, but they could not always identify the person connected to it. The evidence could prove that a crime occurred. It could reveal important details. But without a suspect, the investigation could reach a dead end. That was the reality faced by detectives working on the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg murders in the years following 1987. The original investigators had collected evidence and documented the crime scenes. They had followed leads and attempted to understand what happened during the couple's final days. They had worked with the tools available at the time, but despite those efforts, the person responsible remained unidentified. The passage of time created the appearance that the case might never be solved. But the evidence did not disappear. It remained preserved, waiting for a future generation of investigators with better technology and new methods. That became one of the most important lessons of the case. An investigation can become inactive, but evidence can continue to speak. When genetic genealogy entered the world of criminal investigations, it changed the possibilities. The technology allowed investigators to search beyond traditional databases and examine genetic relationships. Instead of searching only for a direct match, investigators could trace family connections and build a path toward identifying an unknown person. The process required extensive analysis. It required experts who understood genetics, investigators who understood criminal cases, and careful verification at every stage. The breakthrough in the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case demonstrated the power of combining science with traditional police work. DNA alone did not solve the case. Investigators still had to examine information, follow procedures, and build a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. The conviction also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence for future generations. In 1987, investigators could not have predicted how valuable that evidence would become decades later. They could not have known that technology would eventually unlock information that seemed impossible to access. But they preserved it. That decision became critical. Across the country, other investigators looked at the case as proof that old investigations could still have new life. Cold case units began revisiting evidence from decades earlier. Families who had spent years waiting for answers saw renewed possibilities. The phrase cold case solved often creates the impression of a sudden breakthrough, A headline appears, an arrest is made, a mystery is resolved. But behind every solved cold case is a long process. There are years of unanswered questions. There are investigators who continue searching. There are families who refuse to forget. There are scientists who develop new methods. There are countless hours spent examining details that may eventually lead to the truth. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case represented all of those elements. It was also a reminder that justice does not always happen quickly. The families of Jay and Tanya waited more than 3 decades. They experienced the frustration of watching time pass while the person responsible remained unidentified. The emotional impact of such a long wait is difficult to measure. A family dealing with an unsolved murder does not only lose someone once, they experience the original loss, then years of uncertainty afterward. They continue searching for answers while trying to preserve the memory of the person they lost. For the families of Jay and Tanya, the conviction provided something they had not had for years: certainty. The legal system had examined the evidence and reached a conclusion. The person responsible had been identified. The unanswered questions that had followed them for decades finally had an answer. But the case also carried a message for future investigations. Technology continues to change the way crimes are solved. The methods used in 2018 were unimaginable in 1987. Future advances may reveal answers in cases that currently appear impossible to solve. Every unsolved case contains evidence. Every piece of evidence contains information. The challenge is finding the tools capable of understanding it. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg investigation became a symbol of that idea. It showed that time does not erase the possibility of justice. It showed that investigators can return to old cases with new perspectives. It showed that victims of cold cases are not forgotten simply because years have passed. The story also demonstrated the importance of remembering victims beyond the crime itself. For many people who followed the case, the headline was about the killer finally being identified. But for those closest to Jay and Tanya, the story was always about 2 lives that ended too soon. They were not just names in an investigation file. They were family members. They were friends. They were people whose futures were taken away. The resolution of the case allowed the world to finally move from questions to answers, but the memory of Jay and Tanya remained the most important part of the story. More than 30 years after their deaths, their names became connected to a different kind of headline, not only a story of tragedy, but also a story of determination. A story showing that evidence can survive. A story showing that investigations can continue. A story showing that even after decades of silence, the truth can still be found. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case began as a mystery that seemed impossible to solve. It ended as an example of how persistence, science, and the refusal to abandon victims can change everything. But the impact of the case was only beginning. The breakthrough that solved this investigation would influence how law enforcement approached cold cases around the world. It would become a turning point in the history of forensic investigation. And the lessons learned from the search for Jay and Tanya would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg did not end when the courtroom reached its decision. The conviction brought legal closure to a case that had remained unresolved for more than 3 decades. But the impact of the investigation continued far beyond the verdict. Their names became connected to one of the most significant examples of how modern forensic science could transform a cold case. A crime that once appeared impossible to solve became proof that evidence preserved from the past could still reveal the truth in the future. For investigators, the case represented a powerful lesson in patience. Homicide investigations often depend on immediate breakthroughs. Detectives search for witnesses while memories are fresh. They follow leads while information is still available. They try to identify suspects before time changes the circumstances surrounding the crime. But cold cases operate differently. They require a different kind of determination. They require investigators to believe that an answer may still exist, even when years have passed without progress. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg investigation demonstrated that belief. When the murders first occurred in 1987, the investigators working on the case had no way of knowing how important their efforts would become decades later. They documented scenes, collected evidence, and preserved information that would eventually allow a future generation of investigators to continue the search. At the time, DNA technology was still developing. The idea that genetic material collected from a crime scene could later identify a person through family connections was beyond what most investigators could imagine, but the evidence remained. That evidence became the bridge between two different eras of criminal investigation. The first era was traditional detective work. Investigators relied on interviews, observations, physical evidence, and experience. They searched for patterns and connections. They attempted to understand the movements of Jay and Tanya before their deaths. They tried to determine who may have crossed paths with them. The second era was defined by advanced forensic science. Genetic genealogy introduced a new approach. It allowed investigators to examine relationships within DNA information and create investigative paths that had not previously existed. The breakthrough in the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case became a defining moment because it showed how these two eras could work together. Technology alone did not solve the case. The DNA analysis provided an important lead, but investigators still had to apply traditional investigative methods. They had to verify information, confirm connections, and ensure that the evidence supported the conclusions being reached. The process showed that solving cold cases is rarely about one single discovery. It is about many pieces coming together over time. The arrest and conviction of William Earl Talbot Vettens also changed public understanding of what a cold case could be for years. Many people believed that if a crime remained unsolved for decades, the chances of finding the person responsible became smaller and smaller. This case challenged that belief. It demonstrated that time does not always protect someone who commits a violent crime. It showed that scientific advancement can reopen investigations and create opportunities that did not exist before. The impact was felt by investigators around the world. Law enforcement agencies began examining old cases with renewed interest. Evidence that had once been considered difficult or impossible to use was reconsidered. Cold case units explored whether advances in DNA technology could provide new answers. Families of victims also saw the case as a source of hope. For many families, an unsolved murder creates a unique form of suffering. They know their loved one is gone, but they do not know what happened or who was responsible. They are forced to live with uncertainty while waiting for answers that may never come. The resolution of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case reminded those families that time does not necessarily mean the end of the search. A case can remain alive. Evidence can remain valuable. The truth can still emerge. But the investigation also raised important conversations about the future of forensic technology. Genetic genealogy brought extraordinary possibilities, but it also introduced questions about privacy and the use of personal genetic information. As more law enforcement agencies began using these methods, society faced new challenges. How should genetic information be handled? What protections should exist? How can investigators balance solving crimes with respecting individual privacy? The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg case became part of this larger discussion because it showed both the incredible power of genetic technology and the responsibility that comes with using it. For investigators, however, the central purpose remained unchanged, seeking justice for victims. The case was never simply about identifying a suspect. It was about answering questions that had haunted two families for decades. It was about recognizing that Jay and Tanya's lives mattered. Their story became a reminder that victims should never become forgotten because a case remains unsolved. Behind every cold case file is a person. Behind every piece of evidence is a family waiting. Behind every investigation is a search for truth. The conclusion of this case also demonstrated the importance of collaboration. Detectives, forensic experts, prosecutors, and investigators from different generations all contributed to the final outcome. The case was solved because people continued working toward the same goal despite the passage of time. The investigation stretched across decades, but the mission remained consistent. Find the truth. Identify the person responsible. Seek justice for the victims. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg became one of perseverance against time. It showed that even when a case appears frozen, it may still contain the information needed for a future breakthrough. A crime scene from 1987 eventually became the foundation of a conviction decades later. A mystery that had remained unsolved became a landmark example of forensic innovation. Yet perhaps the most lasting lesson was not about technology. It was about commitment. Yet the commitment of investigators who continued searching. The commitment of families who continued remembering. The commitment to the idea that every victim deserves answers. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg began as a devastating tragedy. They became a decades-long investigation. Then they became a turning point in the history of cold case investigations. Their story showed that the passage of time does not erase the possibility of justice. It showed that evidence can wait. It showed that answers can come from places no one expected. And it showed that even after 30 years of silence, a cold case can still speak. The resolution of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg murder case became more than the conclusion of one investigation. It became a defining moment in the history of modern criminal justice. A case that began in an era before advanced DNA analysis had become common eventually became one of the clearest demonstrations of how technology could transform the search for truth. The story was no longer only about a crime committed in 1987. It became a story about time, evidence, persistence, and the belief that even the oldest mysteries can still be solved. For decades, the case represented uncertainty. The families of Jay and Tanya lived with questions that had no answers. Investigators carried the weight of a case that remained unfinished. The community remembered a tragedy that had never received a full resolution. The passage of time created distance, but it did not erase the importance of what happened. The breakthrough changed everything. When investigators identified William Earl Talbot's set-in through genetic genealogy, the case became a powerful example of how forensic science had entered a new era. The investigation showed that evidence collected decades earlier could still have value. It showed that the tools available today can reveal information that investigators in the past could never have accessed. The importance of preserving evidence became one of the most significant lessons from the case. In many investigations, the early stages determine what possibilities remain in the future. Evidence collected during the original investigation may not immediately provide answers, but it can become critical when new technology emerges. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg case demonstrated exactly why investigators preserve evidence carefully. The evidence did not solve the case in 1987, but it helped solve the case in 2018. That difference represented a major shift in criminal investigation. For many years, cold cases were often viewed as investigations where time worked against everyone involved. Witnesses moved away, memories faded, physical evidence became harder to analyze. The possibility of solving the crime seemed to become smaller with every passing year. But advances in forensic science changed that assumption. The development of genetic genealogy created new opportunities. Investigators could examine DNA information in ways that were impossible decades earlier. They could search for relationships, identify possible family connections, and create investigative leads from genetic information. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg case became part of a larger transformation happening throughout law enforcement. Across the United States, agencies began reviewing old homicide cases. Evidence that had been stored for years was reconsidered. Cases that had remained inactive were reopened. Families who had spent decades without answers began receiving unexpected news. A new question emerged among investigators everywhere. What other unsolved crimes could now be solved? The answer would continue to unfold as genetic genealogy was used in more investigations. But every breakthrough also carried responsibility. The use of genetic information created important discussions about privacy, consent, and the balance between solving crimes and protecting personal information. The same technology that could provide justice for victims also required careful consideration about how it should be used. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg case became part of that conversation because it represented both sides of the issue. It demonstrated the incredible ability of science to solve crimes, while also showing why ethical guidelines were necessary. For the families of Jay and Tanya, however, the focus remained on justice. More than 30 years had passed since their loved ones were killed. Their lives had continued while carrying the weight of an unresolved tragedy. They had experienced the frustration of waiting. They had faced the possibility that the truth might never be known. The conviction changed that reality. It provided an answer. It provided accountability. And it confirmed that their loved ones had not been forgotten. The emotional importance of solving a cold case is difficult to measure. A conviction cannot reverse the past. It cannot restore the years lost. It cannot remove the pain of losing someone. But it can bring certainty. It can replace unanswered questions with fact. It can allow families to move forward, knowing that the person responsible has been identified. The case also highlighted the dedication of investigators who worked across generations. The detectives involved in the original investigation and the investigators who reopened the case decades later were connected by the same goal. They were searching for answers. They were searching for justice. They were searching for the truth about what happened to Jay and Tanya. Their work demonstrated that solving a cold case is often a marathon, not a sprint. Some investigations are solved quickly. Others require years or even decades. But every case depends on people willing to continue searching. The story of this investigation also changed public perception of unsolved crimes. Before the rise of modern forensic technology, many people assumed that a crime unresolved for decades might remain unresolved forever. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case challenged that idea. It showed that the passage of time does not necessarily destroy evidence. It showed that technology can create new opportunities. It showed that investigators can return to old questions with new methods. The case became a symbol of hope for families across the world who continue waiting for answers. Every year, thousands of crimes remain unsolved. Behind every file is a victim, a family, and a community searching for closure. The success of cases like this demonstrates why those investigations continue. Because sometimes the answer is not lost. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the right moment to be discovered. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg also serves as a reminder of the importance of remembering victims as people. The attention surrounding the case often focused on the investigation, the technology, and the eventual arrest. But at the center of everything were two lives. Jay and Tanya were young people whose futures were taken away. They had families who loved them. They had people who missed them. They had stories that existed long before their names became associated with a criminal investigation. The purpose of solving the case was not only to identify a suspect. It was to honor them. It was to recognize that their lives mattered. It was to ensure that their deaths were not forgotten. The investigation that began in 1987 eventually became a landmark example of what is possible when determination meets innovation. It showed the world that cold cases are not necessarily closed chapters. They are unfinished stories that may still have answers hidden within them. Decades after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg were killed, the truth finally emerged. A case that once seemed impossible to solve became a reminder that justice can survive time. The evidence waited. The investigators continued searching. And eventually, the silence was broken. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg became one of the most powerful examples of how a cold case can transform from a forgotten mystery into a landmark investigation. For more than 3 decades, their names were connected to unanswered questions, painful memories, and a search for justice that seemed to have no ending. But the eventual breakthrough proved something that investigators around the world had long believed. A case is never truly finished as long as evidence remains and people continue searching for the truth. The murders had taken place in 1987, at a time when forensic technology was limited compared with the tools available today. Investigators could collect evidence, document crime scenes, and build theories, but they did not have the ability to analyze genetic information the way modern science allows. The evidence existed, but its full potential remained hidden. For years, that evidence waited. The passage of time created the illusion that the case might never be solved. The headlines faded. The investigation moved away from the public spotlight. The world continued changing while one question remained unanswered. Who was responsible for the deaths of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg? But behind the scenes, the case was never completely forgotten. Cold case investigations often depend on persistence. They require investigators to believe that answers may still exist, even when years pass without progress. They require families to continue hoping despite disappointment. They require technology to advance enough to reveal what earlier generations could not see. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg investigation represented all of those elements. When investigators eventually turned to genetic genealogy, they entered a new era of criminal investigation. The method changed the way law enforcement approached cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Instead of depending only on traditional DNA comparisons, investigators could examine genetic relationships and follow connections through family histories. This approach created possibilities that had never existed before. A person who had remained unknown for decades could now be identified through a genetic trail. A case that had reached a dead end could now move forward. Evidence that had once seemed incomplete could become the most important part of the investigation. The breakthrough that led investigators to William Earl Talbot Denton demonstrated the extraordinary power of this technology, but the technology itself was only one part of the story. The investigation still required careful work. Detectives had to confirm information. They had to follow procedures. They had to ensure that the evidence gathered would stand in court. The process showed that science can open a door, but investigators still have to walk through it. The conviction of Talbot became a significant moment in the history of cold cases because it represented the meeting of two generations of investigative work. The first generation collected and preserved the evidence. The second generation used modern tools to interpret it. Neither could have solved the case alone. Together, they created the answer. The impact of the case reached far beyond Washington state. Law enforcement agencies around the world began examining how genetic genealogy could assist in solving violent crimes. Investigators revisited old cases that had remained unresolved for years. Families who had lost hope began wondering whether their own cases might someday experience a similar breakthrough. The phrase cold case took on a different meaning. It no longer represented a case that was simply abandoned. Instead, it represented a case waiting for the right moment, waiting for new technology, waiting for new information, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The story of Jay and Tanya also highlighted another important reality. Solving a crime is not only about finding the person responsible, it is about restoring a sense of justice for those left behind. For the families, decades without answers created a different kind of suffering. There was grief, but there was also uncertainty. They knew they had lost someone they loved, but they did not know the full truth of what happened. The conviction changed that. It did not erase the pain. It did not bring back the years that were lost. But it provided something incredibly important: certainty. After decades of questions, there was finally an answer. The case also became a reminder of why victims must remain at the center of every investigation. The technology, the courtroom, and the headlines were important parts of the story, but they were never the most important part. The most important part was Jay and Tanya, two young people whose lives ended far too soon, two families who spent decades waiting, to victims whose names became connected with a search for justice that crossed generations. Their stories showed that behind every cold case is a human story. Every file represents someone. Every piece of evidence represents a possibility. Every investigation represents a promise that the victims will not be forgotten. The case also demonstrated how much criminal investigations have changed. A detective working in 1987 could not have imagined that a technology decades in the future would help solve the crime. The investigators who reopened the case could not have done so without the work of those who came before them. The investigation was a chain stretching across time. Each person involved added another link. Each discovery brought the truth closer. Each advancement created a new opportunity. The conclusion of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quillenborg case became a message heard throughout the criminal justice community. Do not underestimate old evidence. A clue that seems insignificant today may become the breakthrough of tomorrow. A case that appears impossible may simply require a new approach. A mystery that lasts for decades may still have an answer waiting to be found. As the years continue to pass, the lessons from this investigation remain important. Technology will continue evolving. New forensic methods will continue developing. More cold cases will be reopened. More families will receive answers they once thought were impossible. The story of Jay and Tanya became part of that larger movement. Their case represented tragedy, but it also represented determination. It represented loss, but it also represented hope. It represented the darkest moments of a criminal investigation, but also one of the greatest achievements of modern forensic science. More than 30 years after their deaths, the questions surrounding Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg were finally answered. The evidence that had remained silent for decades finally spoke. The investigation that had seemed frozen finally moved forward. And the search for justice that began in 1987 finally reached its destination. Yet the importance of the case would continue long after the verdict. Because the greatest legacy of this investigation was not only that one mystery was solved, it was the reminder that every victim deserves the chance for their story to be heard. And sometimes, even after decades of silence, the truth is still waiting to be discovered. More than 3 decades after Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg disappeared during what should have been an ordinary trip, their case became a symbol of something once thought impossible: the ability of modern science to reach back through time and uncover the truth. What began as a heartbreaking disappearance in 1987 became one of the most significant cold case investigations of its era. It was a story of loss, unanswered questions, determination, and a search for justice that refused to end, even when years passed and hope seemed to disappear. The final resolution of the case did not erase the tragedy. Nothing could bring Tanya back. Nothing could restore the years their families spent waiting for answers. Nothing could undo the pain caused by a crime that took 2 young lives far too soon. But the conclusion of the investigation provided something that had been missing for decades: accountability and the knowledge that the truth had finally been uncovered. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg became more than a criminal investigation. They became an example of how the future can sometimes solve the mysteries of the past. Evidence collected in one generation was analyzed using technology from another. Investigators who never met and worked decades apart became connected by the same mission: finding the truth. The case demonstrated one of the most important lessons in modern law enforcement: time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes, time reveals its value. In 1987, detectives could not have predicted how important DNA would become. They could not have imagined that genetic information would eventually become one of the most powerful tools in solving cold cases. They worked with the resources available at that moment, documenting evidence and preserving information that would later become the foundation of a breakthrough. Their work mattered. The investigators who came decades later were not starting from the beginning. They were continuing a journey that had already started. They were building on the dedication of those who had searched for answers when the technology was not yet available. That connection between generations of investigators became one of the defining aspects of the case. The investigation showed that solving a cold case is rarely the result of one person or one discovery. It is the result of many efforts coming together over time. Detectives, forensic specialists, prosecutors, and families all played a role in moving the case forward. The breakthrough through genetic genealogy changed the future of cold case investigations. It demonstrated that DNA could do more than identify a person through a direct database match. It could reveal family connections and create investigative paths that had previously been impossible. The success of this case encouraged investigators across the world to look again at old files. Cases that had remained unsolved for years were reconsidered. Evidence that had once seemed limited was examined with new technology. The message was clear: a cold case is not necessarily a closed case. It may simply be waiting for the right moment. The story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg also became a reminder that every investigation begins and ends with people. Behind the forensic evidence, behind the headlines, and behind the courtroom arguments were 2 victims whose lives mattered. Jay and Tanya were not remembered because of the crime that took them away. They were remembered because of who they were before that crime. They were family members. They were friends. They were people with futures that should have continued. The purpose of solving their case was not only to identify the person responsible. It was to recognize the value of their lives and acknowledge the impact their loss had on everyone who loved them. For their families, the journey lasted far longer than anyone should ever have to experience. Decades of uncertainty created a unique kind of pain. There was the grief of losing someone, but also the frustration of not knowing the full story. The resolution provided an answer to a question that had remained unanswered for generations. That answer mattered. The case also became part of a larger discussion about the future of forensic science. Genetic genealogy demonstrated incredible potential, but it also introduced important questions about privacy and responsible use. As technology continues to advance, society must continue discussing how these tools should be applied. The challenge will always be finding the balance between solving crimes and protecting personal information. But the impact of the Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg case remains undeniable. It showed that investigators should continue searching. It showed that evidence should be preserved. It showed that victims should never be forgotten. It showed that justice can sometimes arrive decades after a crime occurs. The phrase justice delayed often carries a sense of sadness because no amount of time can replace what was lost. But in cold case investigations, delayed justice can still be meaningful. A family receiving answers after 30 years is different from receiving answers immediately, but the importance of that truth does not disappear. The resolution of this case became a source of hope for other families still waiting. Families who wonder if their loved one's case will ever be solved. Families who look at old photographs and remember a person whose story remains unfinished. Families who continue waiting for the phone call that will finally bring answers. The Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg investigation showed them that impossible does not always mean impossible forever. The future can change the past. A discovery made years later can transform everything. A piece of evidence that once seemed silent can eventually tell the entire story. The legacy of this case is not only that a murderer was identified after decades. Its deeper meaning is that persistence matters, investigations matter, evidence matters, and victims matter. The case began with fear and uncertainty. It continued through years of unanswered questions. It survived decades of silence. And it ended with the truth finally emerging. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg remain a tragic reminder of the devastating consequences of violent crime, but they also remain an example of the extraordinary progress that can happen when determination meets technology. From the first investigators who collected evidence in 1987 to the forensic experts who analyzed that evidence decades later, every effort contributed to the final answer. The case proved that time can hide the truth, but it does not always destroy it. Somewhere inside old files, preserved evidence, and forgotten details, answers can remain, waiting, until the right moment arrives, until the right question is asked, until the truth finally has a way to speak. And after more than 30 years of uncertainty, the story of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Quedlinburg finally reached that moment. The cold case was solved. The questions were answered. The silence was broken. And the legacy of their story became a lasting reminder that justice may take time, but the search for truth never truly ends.